You're on.
Okay, let me continue. Okay, there. Tonight's lesson is just one chapter of the book of Numbers, and I called it the resurrection of the dead branch. It's kind of I was a little bit concerned about using the word resurrection when it came to a dead branch from the wilderness, but as we go through the lesson, I think you'll see why I called it, labeled this lesson that way. Last week, this chapter 17 is really a continuation of what we studied for the last week or so. If you remember last time, we looked at the uprising against Moses and Aaron that was led by Korah, who was of the tribe of Levites that was responsible for taking care of the furnishings that are inside the tabernacle. And when I say take care of them, that Moses and Aaron's sons would go in and they would wrap up. We're getting some background here somewhere. Anyway, Moses, Aaron and his sons, they would be responsible for putting the coverings on these furnishings that are in the holy and most holy place. And when they were all wrapped up and covered, then the Kenyites would go and they would carry them from one location to another location when God lifted his cloud and told the Israeli community that they were to move from where they were camped to a new location. But Korah and the people that he led, part of the rebellion was spurred by the fact that when they refused to go into the promised land, God imposed judgment against that whole generation of Israelites, telling them that they were no longer going to be allowed to go into the promised land and that they had to turn around and live in the wilderness until that generation died. And Korah and the frustration of the Israelite people were used by Korah and the other leaders of the community to sponsor a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. But there was more to it than just the fact that they were feeding off the disappointment of the generation that God told was going to be punished and not allowed to go in the promised land. They also had an arrogant feeling that they were God's holy people. And they were just as holy as Moses and Aaron, and they had every right to take over the leadership of the community. They had the right to become the high priest and minister to God in the tabernacle. So they're motivated by self-righteousness, and their arrogant and mistaken belief that God had chosen them to lead the Israelites to the promised land and to perform the sacrifices of worship. This was a widespread rebellion. Now, to quell the rebellion, last week we talked about how Moses proposed a test of fire to Korah and the 250 leaders that appeared before the tent of the meeting with censers of incense that they lit from the brazen altar to make an offering to God. He said, well, make your offering and let's see if God accepts it. And then as they were gathered in front of the tabernacle, Moses went out to the encampment where the Reubenites and the other leaders were located. They refused to come into the tent of the meeting to meet with Moses. So he went out to them and he proposed a test of the earth, basically telling them, well, if you think that God didn't choose me, then the test is that if God will do something new, if he'll open the earth and swallow you up, you know that if the God does that, then God appointed me and it wasn't my idea and I'm not to be blamed for everything that's happening. Well, sure enough, as soon as Moses stopped thinking, the earth opened up and it swallowed up these rebellious men and their families that were standing by their tents, and it took them, the families, the men, and all their possessions into the earth, and they died and disappeared. Immediately, the scene shifted back to the tent of the meeting where God sent a bolt of lightning. He basically killed all of the 250 people, men that were there with the censers. And then God had the priests gather up the censers, pound them into sheets that they put to the brazen altar. We ended up the lesson with still the rebellion hadn't been quelled. And because of that, God basically said, Moses, I'm going to get rid of the entire generation and replace them with your descendants. But for Aaron taking up the silver censer that he used with the altar and incense inside the tabernacle, Aaron runs out and he stands between the dead and the living, and the plague stops. But it stops after 14,700 Israelites had died of the plague. So we see here that the main message that we got from last week's lesson was that because of pride and arrogance, we seek to elevate ourselves to a position or status in opposition or disobedience to God, then God is going to assert his sovereignty and impose his punishment and judgment against us. In a clash of wills, God wins. Now, this week, we are going to continue with the story. In consequence to all the events that we studied last week, we find that God has to affirm his sovereign choice of Aaron as a high priest. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to do a test of having all of the tribes come before the tent of the meeting, each tribe with a branch, a dead branch or a staff or a rod, write their name of the tribe on it. And then for Aaron, the tribe of Levi, instead of writing the tribe of Levi, they wrote Aaron's name on that staff. And then God said that he would go ahead and bring the branch that is presented by the one he chose to be the high priest, bring that branch to life, sprouted. So the main message I want you to get from tonight's lesson, as it ties into the last lesson and a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, is that the resurrected almond branch not only affirmed and authenticated the Aaronic priesthood, but pointed to the new covenant priesthood of Jesus Christ, who is our high priest in heaven. So we have God taking care of affirming the Old Testament priesthood through Aaron, but it also points to our Lord Jesus Christ and his role as a high priest for us. The outline of what we're going to talk about is, I want to talk just an overview for the next 3 chapters that we're going to study in the book of Numbers, chapters 17, 18, and 19. Now, we're going to, after we have this overview, then I'm going to talk about how God miraculously affirmed the priesthood of Aaron and Aaron's sons. And then the final part is the Israelites community finally get the point. And the Israelites finally recognized their sinful rebellion against God and accepted God's punishment of death. So those are the 3 parts. And then we'll get into discussion questions, which I'm beginning to enjoy more and more as we go into those discussions, because the participation of everybody is really inspiring to me. Let's go to part 1, the resurrection of the dead branch. And in that part, we're going to start with the overview of the next 3 chapters we're going to study, chapters 17, 18, and 19. These 3 chapters reveal God's mercy in dealing with the rebellious generation of Israelites before they went back into the wilderness. So in time frame, as Paul mentioned in last question, when did all this take place? Somewhere between 18 months after they departed of Egypt and maybe 2 years and a couple of months. Right in that time frame is when the rebellion took place and these events took place. And they took place before Israel left their encampment and went back into the wilderness. In chapter 17, God reaffirmed the priesthood of Aaron and his sons. Then in chapter 18, God really establishes that the priesthood that was established with Aaron and his son, their inheritance was God himself. They didn't get any land in the promised land. Instead, they were not to be tied to any land ownership, but they were to be dedicated solely to serving the Lord in the tent or in the tabernacle or in the temple when it was eventually built. And so it also explained not only that the Lord was their inheritance, but the Lord would provide for them their food, their needs, and everything else by all the other tribes giving tithes or offerings, a portion of which would go to the priests. And then the Levites themselves that got these offerings, they would offer a tithe themselves to the high priest and Aaron and his sons. So even though a lot of the Levites were called into the service of the Lord and received offerings and portions of offerings from the other 12 tribes, they themselves tithed to the high priest and his sons. So we really talk about how God set up the Levite priesthood and provided for them through these offerings and giving a portion of them to the Levites and then to the priests. The chapter 19 is an unusual chapter because it deals with the sacrifice of a red heifer, a female. And the purpose of that we'll get into is that because during the 38 years that Israel was in the wilderness, they kept on moving from place to place, and the tabernacle really wasn't set up long enough for any of them to come and offer the traditional sacrifices. The other thing is, if you think about it, during the 38 years, over 1 million people died. That whole generation died in the wilderness. They were dealing with death every day as the generation got older and died. And so they came in contact with unclean, dead bodies. And so the red heifer with water was a means of purifying the people as the generation died off in the wilderness. So it makes sense. So when we look at these three chapters, 17, 18, and 19, those are the only chapters that really directly deal with the Israelites for that 38-year period. The scriptures are pretty silent as to what happened. Now you can go to chapter 33 of the book of Numbers, and it will give you a list of every location where the Israelites camped. The next place they camped, it goes right down there. But it's one of the most boring chapters in the Bible because it would be like I said, well, I just got back from my trip from Europe. Everybody say, okay, I went to Germany, and then I went to France, then I went to Italy, and then I went to Greece, and then I went to this, and that's all I say. And you're going to sit there and say, well, what did you do? What did you see? And that's, if you go to chapter 33, that's all it is. It's one place after another with nothing explained as to what they saw, what happened, what they did. It's just a chapter that, and so the one question you can keep in the back of your mind is that why is God completely silent about what the Israelites were doing during this 38-year period? Because when we get to chapter 20, it starts out 38 years later with the second generation returning to the place that we are just finishing leaving, Kadesh, where the second generation is being prepared to go in and take the promised land. So you have 3 chapters that we're going to talk about, a 38-year period gap where we don't have a whole lot of information except the generation died. And then we get to chapter 20, which is 38 years later. So in orientation, this is these 3 books are about all you get as to what was really going on with this generation as they were being punished and died off in the wilderness. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is how God miraculously affirmed the priesthood of Aaron and Aaron's sons. Despite all the events which took place in chapter 16, which I covered earlier tonight and last week, where God killed Korah and his followers for the tent of meeting, caused the earth to swallow up those who rebelled against Moses and Aaron as they and their families stood in front of their tents, and killed 14,700 Israelites by the plague, which spread throughout the Israelite community. The members of the Israelite community had still not accepted Aaron's priesthood. We want to talk about a definition of stiff-necked people. This is a good definition right here. They refuse to acknowledge that they are sinning against God by rebelling against Aaron and Moses. And they weren't willing to accept God's judgment and punishment for their rebellion. And so this is the chapter where God says, I'm going to settle this once and for all. And so he found it necessary to provide instructions to Moses to reaffirm and authenticate Aaron and his sons as a priest, who God appointed to intercede on behalf of the Israelite community and offer sacrifices of worship to the Lord. So what did God tell Moses? He instructed Moses to tell the leaders of the 12 tribes to bring a dead branch, some translations say a staff or a rod, inscribed with the name of their ancestral tribe, and present it to the Lord. In Numbers chapter 17, the first two verses, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and get 12 staffs from them, one from the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. Write the name of each man on his staff. So he went out, picked up a dead stick, wrote their name on it, and came to Moses with the stick, all the 12 tribes. Now, the 12 tribes did not include the tribe of Levi. Now, we know that Jacob had 12 sons, including Levi, but Joseph, his second youngest son, Benjamin was the youngest, he was in Egypt and he married an Egyptian woman and he had 2 sons. And toward the end of Genesis, if you recall, Jacob adopted Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so if you take Levi out, you have 11, but then you add and you take Joseph out and you substitute them with Manasseh and Ephraim, you have 12 tribes. And then the tribe of Levi, Aaron himself was to present a staff, and instead of writing Levi or the ancestral tribe of Levi, he wrote Aaron's name on according to God's instruction. So each of these dead sticks, if you will, or rods or staffs, they represented one of the 12 tribes, and you added Aaron's staff or stick with his name written on it. And then Numbers 17:3, we get the scriptures say, on the staff of Levi, write Aaron's name, for there must be one staff for the head of each ancestral tribe. And so in lieu of Levi, it's Aaron that's there. And then God further instructed Moses to place the 13 dead branches in the tent of meeting in front of the ark of the testimony, and told Moses and the leaders of the 12 tribes that God would cause the branch of the man he chose to serve as a priest to sprout. So in Numbers chapter 17, verses 4 and I think 4 and 5, the scriptures say, place them in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony where I meet with you. The staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout, and I will rid myself of this constant grumbling against you by the Israelites. Now, there's some debate in the scholarship in the various books that I researched as to whether or not Moses literally went into the Holy of Holies, and placed these sticks right in front of the Ark of the Covenant, or he placed them right in front of the altar of incense in the holy place, which is outside the curtain. Because the scriptures say that God told Moses to place them in front of the ark where I meet with you. If you remember previous studies of the scriptures, God met with Moses above the mercy seat in between the cherubim. So that would indicate to me that Moses probably did go into the most holy place and place these sticks right in the most holy place before the ark of the testimony. Now, the other thing is that there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not there was any bias in the way that Moses placed Aaron's stick. Did he put it in place where it'd be favored or not? Most scholars believe that he just spread out the sticks, and probably Aaron's was somewhere in the middle. There's no scripture that describes that, but Jewish tradition indicates that it was probably placed in the middle somewhere. Now, that's the test. By miraculously bringing the dead branch inscribed with Aaron's name to life, God not only reaffirmed and authenticated the Aaronic priesthood, but put to rest the complaint of the rebellious Israelite community. Numbers chapter 17, verses 6 through 9 says, so Moses spoke to the Israelites, and their leaders gave him 12 staffs, one for the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. And Aaron's staff was among them. Moses placed the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the testimony. The next day Moses entered the tent of the testimony and saw that Aaron's staff, which represented the house of Levi, had not only sprouted, but had budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. Then Moses brought out all the staffs from the Lord's presence to all the Israelites. They looked at them, and each man took his own staff. So, in order to authenticate and reaffirm that God's choice of the high priest was Aaron, he miraculously caused this stick, a dead piece of wood, to come back to life. It's almost like a resurrection, the dead to the living. Now, it's interesting that not only did Aaron's rod or stick sprout back to life, but it produced buds, blossoms, and almonds, all present at the same time. Now, anybody that knows anything about how fruit trees grow or how nut trees grow, which are considered fruit trees, the first thing that you get is a little bud. And then you get a blossom. And then the blossom becomes the fruit. And it's a stage or sequential production of the fruit, starting with the bud, the blossom. You don't get a tree that gets all three of them at the same time. It goes in a progressive way. So that is in a way a form of a miracle itself, that not only did it come to life, but here you had a branch, an almond branch that had all three, the bud, the blossom, and the almond, the ripe fruit. So when we say that they had them all at the same time, I went and researched and tried to figure out the significance of that. And it's interesting that if you take the almond as the ripe fruit, that is Aaron as a priest now. You take the blossoms, and that's his sons that are shortly going to become the priests. You take the buds, and those are the priests of the future. It really talks about the Aaronic priesthood going from generation to generation. It's going to stay in the Aaronic line, and that's why we call it the Aaronic priesthood. So we also, the other thing about the almond is the almond tree in the land of Canaan is one of the first trees to blossom, bud, blossom, and produce fruit. It really signals the spring harvest or the first fruits. And as we studied before, anytime we start talking about the first fruits, we're talking about not only what's set apart to God, we're talking about Jesus as being the first fruit. And so here it's significant that it's almond. The question that I came up with, and that's because I think like a lawyer, is were all the branches, all the sticks that were brought by the tribes almond branches? Or were they some other sticks that he actually converted, in Aaron's case, converted to an almond that sprouted? It doesn't tell you what kind of sticks they were, what kind of tree they came from. It just says that they were rods or dead sticks. So there could be a miracle built into the fact that these are just sticks of unknown origin, and all of a sudden Aaron has miraculously an almond stick that produces fruit and blossoms and buds. The almond tree is known as a harbinger or a foretelling or a alert, if you will, that spring is coming and the fruits are going to be harvested. In the Hebrew language, almond translates as the watchman, and watchman is another signal towards the Messiah. So the significance of the budding of this almond branch, the almond blossoms and everything else, is by itself pointing to Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Aaron's dead branch to reaffirm and authenticate Aaron and Aaron's sons and descendants as a high priest pointed to Jesus as a branch of Jesse, who first died on the cross and then was resurrected before he assumed the position as our eternal high priest in heaven, where he intercedes on our behalf. It's interesting that during Jesus's earthly ministry, he came and he wasn't the high priest. He didn't fulfill the role of a priest during his earthly ministry. He was a sinner, and his purpose was to die on the cross as an acceptable sacrifice for our salvation. But once he died and God resurrected him and he returned to heaven, then he assumed the role of the high priest. And if you look at the priesthood in the Old Testament is from the tribe of Levi, the Aaronic priesthood. But Jesus wasn't from the tribe of Levi, he's from the tribe of Judah. And so what we have here is that the new covenant priesthood is Jesus, and that Jesus as a high priest also from the tribe of Judah, which is the tribe of King David, and he merges the role of prophet, king, and high priest. And he carries on that role as a high priest in heaven, interceding on our behalf. Now, after the branches were taken out of the tent of the meeting, and the branches were then given over to the other leaders of the tribes, and they just got their bare stick back. But Aaron's had this blossoming and everything. God instructed Moses to take that and put it in the Ark of the Testimony. And so in verses 10 through 11 of chapter 17, the book of Numbers says, the Lord Moses, put back Aaron's staff in front of the testimony to be kept as a sign to the rebellious. This will put an end to the grumbling against me, so they will not die. Moses did just as the Lord commanded him. Now, the placement of Aaron's branch in the Ark of the Testimony permanently memorialized God's choice of Aaron, his sons and descendants, as a priest chosen by God. Now, if you ever watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, you're not supposed to open the Ark of the Testimony. In the Ark of the Testimony, you had 3 items. You had the 2 tablets with the 10 commandments, you had the jar of manna, and then you had Aaron's rod. And they were put into the ark and covered by the mercy seat. The only person that would see them is God. So what is it a reminder to? It's really a reminder that God, looking through the mercy seat, God looks how he's provided and provided grace to the people he's chosen. He's given them the law, 10 commandments. He's given the manna, the food, and then he gives them the rod of Aaron, which is the priesthood and the service worship to God. And so you can also say that the rod being one from each tribe, and then Aaron receiving the rod for the tribe of Levi, is the scepter that ultimately Jesus takes over the rule. So there's a dual meaning there. By distinguishing Aaron's branch from the rest of the branches that were offered to God, God ended the controversy as to who he chose to be the high priest and to provide the services. Now we get to the final sentences of this chapter, and that is the Israelites finally recognized their sinful rebellion against God and accepted God's punishment of death. In verses 12 and 13, the book of Numbers, chapter 17, it says, the Israelites said to Moses, we will die. We are lost. We are all lost. Anyone who even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to die? What they were saying is that they recognized the error of attempting to take away the intercessory and worship services of the high priest and put themselves in the tabernacle. Korah tried it with 250 leaders and got fried. They knew that they could not function as a high priest, and that the role of being in the tabernacle, the role was set apart to Aaron, Aaron's sons, and the priesthood that followed. They also, it's a recognition that God's punishment for their sin of rebelling against Moses and Aaron was a punishment of death. And they knew that they were going to die in the wilderness. There's an acceptance of God's judgment. And that's an important part here, because what they're saying is that once God affirmed that Moses and Aaron were chosen by him, and that their rebellion against Moses and Aaron was a rebellion against God, and that they had sinned against God, they recognized that God's judgment, that they would die in the wilderness, was a judgment of death. And so what we have here is the period of time just before they go back into the wilderness, and then this gap of 38 years where that's exactly what happened. This generation died in the wilderness. The Aaronic priesthood under the Old Testament covenants, which God made with Israel, was firmly established and would continue until replaced by the once and for all new covenant priesthood of Jesus. The fear of the Israelites about what would happen to them if they tried to approach or ever came near to God resulted in their acceptance of the priesthood of Aaron and his sons, and it led them to recognize their rebellion against God as being sin and God's judgment being just. Having acknowledged their disobedience, rebellion, and sin against God, they resigned themselves to accept the judgment that God imposed. And they acknowledged that they would all die in the wilderness. Where do you get this information, or where do you get this inference? While they're in the wilderness, they raised the next generation. And the next generation was the one that had no problems about going into Canaan and following God's direction and conquering the people in the Canaanite community. So what we have here is their sin and their recognition of their sin. And as we'll see in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses recounted the history of the first generation to them, that this next generation was prepared to fulfill God's promise. And so, one of the things that God's judgment and punishment and our acknowledgement of our sin does, it enables us to receive God's grace. And in this case, God's grace was carried to the next generation. So that's the study portion of the lesson. And we have two discussion questions that start on page 11 of the outline. And so as we open up for everybody to be unmuted, when you want to present your response to the question, raise your hand, be recognized, and let's have a lively discussion tonight for the conclusions. Okay. So as far as our conclusions and applications, like Aaron's branch, which was dead and then was miraculously resurrected to confirm God's sovereignty and choice of Aaron as the high priest, Jesus died on the cross and was miraculously resurrected before he became our high priest in heaven. During his ministry on earth, Jesus did not act as our high priest. The Aaronic priesthood was still in place until it was replaced by Jesus after Jesus was resurrected. And as Pastor said, it came to an end when the Romans conquered Jerusalem and tore down the temple. Under God's Old Testament covenant with Israel, the Aaronic priesthood came from the tribe of Levi. However, under the new covenant, Jesus, who descended from the tribe of Judah, became our high priest, ending and replacing the Old Testament priesthood. Both priesthoods demonstrate the necessity of having a high priest intercede on behalf of God's chosen people. Like Aaron was chosen by God to be the high priest under God's Old Testament covenant with Israel, Jesus was chosen by God to be our eternal new covenant priest. So that concludes this lesson, but what we're going to get to next week is a little bit more detail about the Levite priesthood and how God was their inheritance and how God provided for their maintenance and care, even though they were not allotted any land in the promised land.